Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and over the next couple of hours, we're going to be covering a lot of different topics. First half hour here, we're going to focus on Islam and how can you talk to your Muslim friends, neighbors, coworkers, and others. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. Then we're going to get back into some of the issues in the news. Of course, we have an impeachment trial taking place, so I have some comments about that. A little bit later, we will have in the next hour Warren Farrell with us, talking about this gender policy council and what some of the transgender issues are that are surfacing in the administration. And then 2 o'clock hour, Carol Swain will be with us. Carol oftentimes has been with us as an individual that speaks to the issue of African-American history, Black history, especially it's Black History Month. And, of course, she was part of the 1776 Commission, which was disbanded by President Biden. But we might talk a little bit about that, but mostly about the issue of immigration. She's become quite an expert on that as well. And immigration policy under the Biden administration, of course, is something we also talk about. So there are lots of topics we're going to be addressing over the next couple of hours, and hope you can be with us for the entirety of the program. But let me first of all introduce in studio with us today Renod Bejjani, and he is the founder and president of iHope Ministries. Now, if you'd like to know a little bit more, we have iHopeMinistries.org as a link on the website. This would be a great opportunity for you to connect up with them, because this is a ministry really to help you as an everyday Christian be able to share your faith with your Muslim friends. And he is the author of Muslims 5 Biblical Essentials, which is really helpful for Christians who are curious or seekers, and also The Way to Paradise, a groundbreaking Bible study really tailored to our Muslim friends. And so, Renod, it's great to have you in the studio with us today.
It is so good to be with you. Thank you.
You and I corresponded years ago, and then I met up with you just recently because of a good friend, Tina Jacobson, and
yes,
you and I were at an event where I was speaking, and you actually did not fall asleep the entire time, so that was good.
Yes.
And I said, let's get you on to talk about this, because you know as well as I do that if you come up to the average Christian and say, have you ever reached out to your Muslim friends? They go, I have no idea what I would say. I don't know what to do. And so this is your ministry, and there are some great resources, books, trips, speaking, and all the rest. But I guess the obvious starting point is, how did you get into this particular ministry in the first place?
Oh, well, thank you for asking. Well, it started with me as a child. Imagine with me a child at 4 years old, kidnapped, persecuted by Islamic extremists for being a Christian.
Yes.
And that same thing happening for the next 7 years. Then as a teenager, imagine that child having to be in the middle of a war for survival for being a Christian. The thing is that for me, I don't have to imagine that. I lived it, because that's what happened to me. But God took me out of that war as a teenager, brought me to the U.S., and I was full of hate and anger toward Muslims, and I walked away from the Lord in high school. But decades later, God redeemed me and transformed me. And now I'm finding myself serving the God I once denied as an instrument of His redeeming love with the very people I once hated. And the thing that disturbed me, part of what started the ministry, was after God redeemed me, I said, Lord, what is it that you want me to do? And I started seeing and realizing, as hard as my childhood is to imagine, it began where Christianity was born, where by 600 AD, most people were Christian. And today it's 98% Muslim. And I'm seeing the same trends that are happening there, happening here. When I was born, Christianity was about 93% of the people in the U.S. Now it's down to 65% and declining fast. Canada is already down to 55%. Europe, it's 18% identify as church-going Christians. So I was seeing these trends happening here, saying, Lord, what is it that you want me to do about it? And I didn't want my grandchildren or other future generations to encounter what I encountered. And started seeing that Islam is doubling every 10 years here in the U.S. And that vacuum of Christianity declining is being filled by seculars. A lot of the issues you're talking about in your show are being filled by people with worldly values because Christianity is declining. And the main cause, I looked back as what was happening, what happened in the Middle East and North Africa to turn things around. It was that by 600 AD, Christians were in power. They had wealth, they had freedom, and they got distracted from the main thing that God called us to do, which is be His ambassadors, His witnesses in the Great Commission. And I was seeing the same thing has happened in Europe, Western civilization, and especially here in the U.S. And the root cause of that is that Christians have got distracted from the main thing. So I said, Lord, what is it that you want me to do about it? Well, He compelled Karen, my wife, my better half, and myself to begin iHope Ministries, and it is to inspire and empower everyday Christians with practical things so they can help turn around these trends and make it a brighter future for the generations to come.
You know, we've had Tom Doyle and
Yes.
Joanne Doyle in studio just recently, and we were talking about the number of Christians that have been able to develop out of the Muslim world, how many Muslims became Christians. We have Johnny Moore on, and we've talked about that, and even Joel Rosenberg. So the good news
Yes.
is there are probably more Muslims coming to the Lord during these last few decades than in all the centuries previous.
Absolutely.
But the bottom line is, and it brings back to what you do, Renod, is this the need for a lot of everyday Christians
Yes.
to actually be able to be equipped to know what to say to their Muslim friends. And I dare say there's probably no one in this listening audience that doesn't have neighbors or individuals that they work with that are Muslims, and they're
Yes.
probably not very good at trying to share the good news with them, are they?
No, and it is very simple, and that's what we do through our resources, podcasts, blogs, videos. We turn it down to bite-sized pieces just to empower everyday Christians to get involved, and it's a lot simpler than people realize. So yes, I invite people to. We've got as a matter of fact, a webinar coming up. It's free. It's February 25th in the evening. They can find out through our website and register for it, and consume our podcasts, blogs, videos, just to empower them.
Let me just take a break, but when we come back, let me just mention that even as you go to the break, this would be a good time to go to iHopeMinistries.org,
Yes.
and you're going to find a couple of things. First of all, of course, a little bit about you and your wife, some of the books, some of the events, but in particular speaking, because I'm hoping that some people might hear this and say, it would be good to bring you in and teach in a Sunday school class or a church. I know the pandemic and lockdowns have kind of prevented some of that, but I think that's going to change. Of course, all sorts of resources. There's a blog, there's a podcast, of course, there's an online course. So we'll go through all of those different areas. And then you sometimes even take people on kind of mission trips, and maybe that will develop in the future.
Yes.
And most importantly, I hope that you will hit some of those buttons there that say contact or give, that you would pray for this ministry, and then maybe even support this as well, because I think almost all of us recognize how vital it is for us to reach out, just even in this country, to our Muslim friends, neighbors, and coworkers. And then you might even want to go on a mission trip to go out and share the good news with Muslims in other parts of the world. So we're going to continue our conversation right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The political divisions in America are evident to just about anyone, which leads to a sincere question. Are there any issues with significant bipartisan support? Actually, there are quite a number, as George Barna discovered in a post-election survey. As he surveyed Republicans and Democrats, he found a half dozen issues that are supported by a supermajority of voters in both parties. Americans may be divided, but you can still find issues which voters support in overwhelming numbers. More than 4 out of 5 Americans support the idea of expanding the domestic manufacturing base. 4 out of 5 adults support the notion of investing heavily in the improvement of our national infrastructure. Making Social Security and Medicare financially solvent is another bipartisan issue. 8 out of 10 adults back such a concept. Reducing the federal debt is another popular idea for 3/4 of adults. Likewise, reducing the federal income taxes for individuals also appeals to nearly 3/4 of adults. A large majority of Americans want to give parents more school choices for their children. By contrast, George Barna found a clear lack of bipartisan support for many of the key issues in the Biden administration agenda. That would be such items as increasing the number of U.S. Supreme Court judges from 9 to 13 and eliminating the use of fossil fuels as part of the Green New Deal. If you look at his polling results, you realize that there are many important issues where Republican voters and Democrat voters can find common ground. But few of those issues are being promoted. Often it seems to me that many of our political leaders want to increase conflict and polarization rather than solve problems that have overwhelming support. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, continue our conversation in studio for a few more minutes with Renod Bejjani. And if you would like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212, or otherwise just sit back and listen to some of the things we can learn from an individual that has been very equipped to train others, including all of us around the table, to know a little bit more about how to share the good news of the gospel with our Muslim friends, neighbors, and co-workers. And go to the website, iHopeMinistries.org. And I thought I would mention a couple things real quickly before we get into some other details. One is you have on February 25th a webinar. And if people say, well, that might be a good way to stick my toe in the water and see how this all takes place, that is free.
Yes.
And all people need to do is go to your website. And we have a link at our website, pointofview.net, in case people are traveling and don't have a chance to write it down. And just sign up and then be ready to get on their computer and learn, right?
Yes, absolutely. And on this one, we will cover Bible study tailored to Muslim seekers. It is just tailored to their worldview. I've had the privilege, the Lord used me with about 2,000 Muslims to put them through this Bible study, and many of them came to faith in Christ. But for our audience, one of the things that I would say, yes, join us for these webinars. And if you would like, I can cover a couple of points just so people can feel like they've got something out of this as far as being equipped.
Yes, well, and I think we will do that. Let me also mention that you're local here.
Yes.
And so for people in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, if they say, well, I like the webinar, but I'd like you to come and speak speak in our Sunday school class, or I'd like you to maybe when we do a missions outreach, sit in the pulpit and speak to these issues or something like that. So that's available as well. But give us an idea a little bit of what's on the webinar, because whether you're in Dallas or you're listening across the country, you can certainly participate in the webinar. So if people sign up, how long will it be, and what are some of the things you will cover?
Absolutely. It will be 1 hour. It'll be very interactive, and it starts at 7:30 Central Time, goes till 8:30 p.m. Central Time. We've got people joining us from all over the world, so different time zones, but that'll be in the Dallas time. And we are going to cover Bible study tailored to Muslim seekers. So each month, and we do monthly webinars, and they're free. So each month we'll cover a different topic. The next month we will cover Easter for Muslims. And so as far as the Bible study, one of the things is that the most powerful, greatest evangelistic tool ever in the history of the world is the Bible itself. Mm-hmm. So I tell people, just share the Bible with a Muslim. And if God is wooing this Muslim to Jesus, when you offer a Bible, they will take it and they will start studying it on their own. Now, a Muslim, usually it takes them about 2 years, because their worldview as far as salvation is so opposite than Christianity's that it takes some time to process. So we as a Christian can just come alongside there as a friend and be there to possibly answer some questions, but it's best just to give them a Bible. And it's as simple as offering them a Bible. And it can be electronic, digital, so it can be in their own language. And and one of the things when it comes to that is share even the gospel, share it right out of the Bible, because the word of God is powerful. And God spoke and everything was created. So I try not to do it through a lot of my own language with Muslims, because I don't have that kind of power. But the word of God has the power to penetrate the soul. So one of the things we share is the one sentence gospel presentation. So with Muslims, we found it is very effective, and it gets them going on that 2-year journey. So typically, as early as possible in the conversation with a Muslim, I'll say, by the way, I'm a follower of Jesus. What that means is I believe what God says in Romans 10:9 in the Holy Bible, that if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Now, that's what I believe, my friend, but tell me more about your culture, your faith, and where you come from. And what we found is that it empowers Christians to realize sharing the gospel can be as simple as they share Romans 10:9 with them in the context of a relationship, and then open it up to their Muslim friend to talk about their faith. And that just gets the conversation going on a Jesus-centered topic.
Again, Romans 10:9, but another verse that I've always found very helpful is Ephesians 2:8-9, because Islam is so much of a works-oriented salvation. Yes. The 5 pillars of Islam and all of that that is required of them, and to share with them this idea that God actually saves you, and it's grace, not works, that saves you, is very important as well. And then there are oftentimes, and this is, I know, something you do training in as well, there are all sorts of misconceptions that Muslims, even that have come to this country, have about Christianity, right?
Yes, absolutely. And that's the thing about Bible study, is whatever they have questions regarding, we empower Christians not to worry too much about the answers, even though, just in case they're not that equipped yet, but we say, let's find out what God says about that topic in the Bible. And just discover it together with your Muslim friend. And one of the things that also is very empowering for Christians is to offer to pray with their Muslim friend in the name of Jesus. Because Islam, they believe that Jesus is just a prophet.
Right.
But they do believe he's alive and living right now at the right hand of God, and that he will come again. What they don't realize is what else he might be doing at the right hand of God. So we tell them, listen, God reveals in the Holy Bible that Jesus is at the right hand of God interceding on our behalf. And that's why we pray in the name of Jesus. So, my Muslim friend, is there something I can pray for you right now in the name of Jesus? And they typically have requests. And I have offered to pray with over 1,000 Muslims in the
Isn't
name of
that
Jesus, and only 3 have said no, and the rest they accept because they are superstitious. It's like God has said, listen, I've frustrated their prayers for all their lives. They've been praying 5 times a day and they don't get a response. So I've set them up for you. So offer to pray with them in the name of Jesus and get out of the way and see what God will do.
That is amazing. Let's talk about some of the other resources you have, because your book is Muslims 5 Biblical Essentials. That's really helpful to individuals that say, well, I really don't understand very much about our Muslim friends, and that's an attempt to try to educate them, right?
Absolutely. And we take the complex and make it simple because, again, this is about inspiring and empowering everyday Christians. So some of the people that have read the book, even some academics said, that's the best book I've ever read on evangelism. So we take the complex of Islam and we break it down with simple things, make the Muslim worldview very understandable, and it's actionable. So 5 essentials that Jesus modeled and taught and that everyday Christian can do.
Now, you are available for speaking, and I think we're going to come out of this lockdown here, and there are going to be some opportunities for churches. So what is the possibility of somebody scheduling you, and how can they do that? Is there something on the website that would be helpful there?
Yes, absolutely. They'll go to the website, iHopeMinistries.org. I believe you have a link, and they can just contact us. They have speaker request forms, so we can do that live. So I do that regularly, but we can also do it online in case the place is still on lockdown. But so we can do it both ways. So yes, we welcome people to contact us this way. Physically, we can do it right here around the Dallas area as things open up, but we can also do it online all over the place. And of course, travel is still possible.
So let me just mention again, if you click on resources, there's the blog, the podcast, there's the course. If you want to know more about the webinar, again, February 25th is when that will be taking place. And most importantly, there's a button there that says give. And I would encourage people to say, and ask maybe themselves, but even say to their own churches, what are we doing to advance the gospel in the Muslim world? And a lot of churches would like to do that, and they even think about going overseas, but we have a lot of Muslims in this country, millions of them. And so I would encourage people to consider supporting you both in prayer and financial support because of the tremendous and dynamic ministry you have to reach out to the Muslim world. So.
Yes, absolutely. We welcome that. And, you know, what we've been able to track for the last 10 years that the ministry has existed is that now for about every $25 that is donated, that's what it takes to inspire and empower a Christian, everyday Christian, to be involved in the work of the Great Commission. And on average, what we've seen is the average Christian here goes on to build 2.4 gospel relationships with a Muslim. So we need all the support because, again, it will take every Christian getting involved in some way with their time, talents, or treasures in order to turn around the alarming trends and make it a better future for the generations to come.
Renod, thank you for coming in today. And again, the link is to iHopeMinistries.org. We also have it on our website, pointofview.net. And if you'd like to maybe pass this on to some others, you can, of course, send a podcast or even the YouTube video out. And good to have you in the studio. We'll be back right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, some of the articles we've posted today are some ones that we will work our way through for just a little while. At the top of the hour, Warren Farrell will be with us. He's written about and expressed some real concerns about the Gender Policy Council put together by President Biden. And this, I think, comes from an individual that, as I've said before when he's been on with us, wouldn't necessarily agree with a lot of things we say around the table. He's the only man in the history of this country to have been elected 3 times to the board of directors of the National Organization of Women. That being said, though, there are individuals who call themselves feminists, call themselves believers in diversity that are still very concerned about some of the things being put forward by the Biden administration. So we're going to spend some time talking with him about that. Next hour, as I mentioned, Dr. Carol Swain will be with us, and we'll talk about, well, maybe a little bit about Black history, but mostly about immigration, because that's another issue that has surfaced in the Biden administration. So we want to cover those topics. But you might say, are you going to say anything at all about the impeachment trial? Well, of course. And as a matter of fact, that's our first article. And I thought it would be helpful to post this one because it is from Jonathan Turley. Now, it is amazing how many times I end up quoting for this man who, again, in case you're not familiar, is the law professor at George Washington University. Hardly a fan of Donald Trump. Clear. But he is raising the same concerns that I have raised and a few others have raised about this issue of incitement. So this is an article that was posted in The Hill, which is kind of the record, the journalistic record of Capitol Hill or the Capitol itself and of Congress. And he says, it's a little more than a year that's happened since the first impeachment of Donald Trump, and the Senate is poised to pass judgment on him again, of course. And that is, he says, one notable difference. In 2020, his conduct when he came to Ukraine turned on his words alone. This time, the vote to convict could be seen as implicating a host of others in using similar reckless rhetoric. What he's pointing out is that reckless rhetoric is a reckless standard for impeachment. I would say that we could all learn a vicarious lesson from not only Donald Trump, but from many of the other people that he quotes in here as well. And there are a bunch. I mean, including people like Chuck Schumer, Maxine Waters, even Kamala Harris, Nancy Pelosi. I mean, the list is pretty long of people that have engaged in what most people with any sense of civility would consider to be reckless rhetoric. If reckless rhetoric is a justification for impeachment, all the individuals I just mentioned could be impeached. They won't, because we know a lot of this is partisan. But it brings us back to something that, again, a law professor reminds us of, and I tried, not having his kind of background, but still tried to help people understand that we have Supreme Court precedents that have actually rejected the attempt to what he calls criminalize speech. And so we'll get into that in just a minute, because he points out that the Senate will, of course, focus, and did a little bit yesterday, we'll do a lot today and the next couple of days, focus on the remarks by former President Trump as an argument of criminal incitement or even incitement of insurrection. And so he said the House will ask the Senate to convict on how the words were interpreted, even if they did not call for violence. And I think it's, at least for a fair-minded person, you'd have to say that when you say fight, he doesn't mean physically fight. And when he says march, he doesn't mean take over the Capitol. And, of course, there are all sorts of disclaimers about making your voice heard peacefully and patriotically. So, of course, all the way through, Jonathan Turley is reminding us of the adjectives that were there. Okay. So then we get into the key point from a legal point of view. He says cheering on your allies is an act of free speech rather than insurrection. Yet the House impeached Trump for inciting an insurrection or a rebellion. Its article does not charge him with recklessly causing riots or threats to Congress. It alleges an effort to overthrow our government, which is the deepest hole to dig in the House and then fill in the Senate, he says. And then he goes on to say that the Supreme Court has rejected fluid standards to criminalize speech. The Supreme Court is actually on a case based on these remarks would actually say that it should fail. And he quotes one that I used in my commentary a week ago. If you want to go type in the word incitement at pointofview.net, what you will see very quickly is that this is a particular case called Brandenburg versus Ohio, in which the government was not going to allow you to criminalize speech, even when it was, many people think, maybe a little bit over the top rhetoric. And you have two examples. You have one case which had to do with the leaders of the NAACP who called for a boycott of businesses, and then subsequently there was a burning down, or at least an attempt to burn down is probably a better way to say it, of a store, and they were trying to hold the NAACP leaders responsible for the rhetoric that led to arson. And there was a case even the year before the Supreme Court cited from another case in which you actually had a conviction of leaders of the KKK that actually in their rhetoric even seemed to call for violence. And in both of those cases, one involving African-American NAACP leaders, in the other case, KKK white supremacists, I guess you could probably call them, it simply in both cases rejected that. So if the lawyers for Donald Trump are wise, and yesterday's testimony didn't necessarily indicate that they were. One of these individuals was probably one of the worst I think you've ever seen in the United States Senate. But if they're wise, let's hope that there's some wisdom was going to spread out there and common sense. They will go back to those issues of language. And then, of course, you're going to have the whataboutism, which I think is always a weak argument. But if this person's guilty, what about these people? You know, I never let my teenagers get away with that. Well, these teenagers got to do this. Why couldn't we? Well, I'm sorry. But nevertheless, they are going to be talking about Maxine Waters, who called on people to confront Republicans in public. Ariana Presley, who insisted during the violent marches that there needs to be unrest in the streets. Kamala Harris, who claimed that protesters should not let up, even as many of them became violent. Nancy Pelosi, who actually condemned her fellow lawmakers as effective traitors and the enemy within. And, of course, the one that I'm sure will be surfaced more than a few times is when Chuck Schumer stood on the front of the Supreme Court and cited two justices by name, saying, hey, Gorsuch, hey, Kavanaugh, you have unleashed a whirlwind and you are going to pay the price. Okay, of course, you got some others here as well. Even Cori Bush seeming to defend the takeover of a St. Louis prison in a tweet with the words of Martin Luther King Jr. that riots are the language of the unheard. Gretchen Whitmer defending state lawmakers, Cynthia Johnson for calling for soldiers to take Trump supporters and make them pay for harassing them. Then James Comey actually using rhetoric to say the Republican Party needs to be burned down. And even a couple of other quotes they have in here. Washington Post columnist Jennifer Rubin claiming we have to collectively, in essence, burn down the Republican Party. We should level them because if they are survivors, if they are people who weather the storm, they will do it again. And so he points out that if you wanted to try to make a one-to-one connection about the fact that there was a pipe bomb placed at the headquarters of the Republican National Committee, you could argue for that. If you want to talk about some of the assaults on Republicans since some of these things were said, you could make that connection, but we don't. We recognize both from Supreme Court precedents as well as just basic common sense that these over-the-top kind of rhetorical uses and what he calls reckless rhetoric cannot and should not be used to then call for an impeachment of a president. And more importantly, he's wanting to take this to a new level because if indeed this was successful, and there's some question as to whether or not the president will be convicted. But if it was, you can see how this would go in a lot of directions that we certainly would not allow. The lesson I think we as ordinary citizens can understand is whenever we see someone engaging in reckless rhetoric, whether it's on YouTube or whether it's on Twitter, whether it's on Facebook, whether it's a speech where somebody is at a rally. I think we should encourage them to tone it down. And most importantly, if we every once in a while think that we would want to maybe go over the top and engage in reckless rhetoric, just recognize what happened to a sitting president of the United States, now former president of the United States, for using such reckless rhetoric. And I think it brings us back to the need for us to exercise civility, and as the scripture says, to recognize the need for us to tame our tongue. Anyway, that's just a piece that Jonathan Turley wrote, very well written, and it is something we commend to you. It's the first article on our website at pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and then at the top of the hour, we're going to have Warren Farrell with us. And again, individual that has some real concerns, I think legitimate concerns about the Gender Policy Council and just some of the transgender issues and all the rest that are being promoted by the Biden administration. But we do have an action item for you, and I thought I would focus on this a little bit for the local audience. We'll talk about it again in the national audience. But if you go to our website, pointofview.net, you will see near the bottom in the middle section there are 4 action items. Today is for the People Act. And I've mentioned this before, but this is something that I would encourage you to take an action item seriously and to just spend a minute or two letting your elected representative know how you feel about this. If you're not aware of this For the People Act of 2021 is H.R. 1. It is the first bill in Congress. It's also Senate Bill 1. And it last year was actually passed by the House of Representatives. This bill is virtually identical. There's a few differences, but not much. It's basically similar. And what it essentially does is try to take the election concerns that many of us have and go in the wrong direction. I think there have been a number of individuals that have been really concerned about how fair these elections were in 2020. And so that's why you have a lot of state legislators right now filing bills, trying to bring about changes. Well, this is an attempt from the national level by the Democratic leadership to try to federalize these elections. And as a result, actually from the top down, force every state to do some things, which I think would be a mistake. For example, all states must have mail-in voting. All states must have automatic registration to vote. You can vote, basically, you can register to vote online. Matter of fact, you can actually register to vote on the same day as an election. A state cannot require an individual to provide any form of identification for getting an absentee ballot. It expands vast issues like ballot harvesting and on and on and on. The list is pretty long. And I won't bore you with the list. You've probably heard us talk about this before. If you're on other mailing lists, I certainly have seen our friends at American Family Association. Tim Wildman's been talking about this and encouraging your response. If you have certainly been following Jim Dobson, he's put out material about this. And so they certainly encouraged you to contact your member of Congress, because I think this has the possibility of passing the House of Representatives unless they hear from the American people. It passed last time. It may not this time, simply because the margins are much tighter. There aren't as many Democrats under control of the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, but this is why it's all the more important for you to act. So if you go to our website, pointofview.net, go to the action item, you'll scroll down to the bottom. All you have to do then is put in your zip code. I'm going to do it right now, and hit submit, and then up some information. We have a suggested letter that you can then edit any way you want, although I suspect you may want to use it just the way it is, and then you can send it off. And if you say, well, I don't know who my member of Congress is, that's why we encourage you to give us your zip code and your address. Sometimes the zip code's not enough, so we need the address to make sure it goes to the right individual, and it is a painless process. I've had a lot of people say, I really never was very good at contacting my member of Congress, and you have made it very easy. So the For the People Act is our action item today. We're going to move on to some others fairly soon. So if you have not taken the time to click on that button that says Take Action, do so right now. And I'll be mentioning it again at the National Hour. Also, let me just mention my commentary today is about bipartisan issues. This comes from a very good piece that came out a couple of weeks ago when we had George Barna on the program, in which he points out that if you look at the post-election survey done by George Barna and his organization, one of the things that was so striking is they found quite a number of issues, about a half a dozen issues, in which you have a supermajority of both Republicans and Democrats. By that I mean sometimes 70 or 80% of Republicans and Democrats agree with some of these very important issues. And so if you were really wanting to have unity in America and push forward things that have bipartisan support, these are the issues. At the end, I do point out that these aren't necessarily the issues being promoted by the administration right now that says they want unity, but nevertheless, that commentary is up there for you as well. Well, I've waited a few days to talk about this, but our second article is about Bank of America. Now, if you're not familiar with this, there are all sorts of customers now calling for a boycott of Bank of America, and you may not even understand why, but last week, Tucker Carlson kind of led the charge. There are some others that have talked about it, but I want to give him credit, in which he points out that they were able to find that indeed Bank of America was handing over all sorts of account information for hundreds of individuals who their only, if you will, crime was that they were in and around Washington, D.C. on January 6th during the storming of the Capitol. And so here you have the country's second largest bank that just turned over to the FBI all sorts of information. So if you happen to be using an ATM in Washington, D.C., if you happen to have checked into a hotel in Washington, D.C., even if you weren't at the speech by the president, much less in the riots or the storming of the Capitol, you then were on, if you will, the FBI hit list. And so then, so far last week, they'd only brought in one of those individuals for questioning. So far, none have been arrested. But I think you have to recognize that it brings us back to one of the things we've talked about before. This idea of privacy is really sort of flying out the window, and instead the idea of surveillance is taking place now. I don't go to Washington, D.C., but imagine if Kelly Shackelford, who's there all the time, was there on January 6th. I'm not sure that he wasn't. As a matter of fact, he, I think, was actually in a meeting that day, and I wonder if, I need to ask him if he was one of the people, he may not use Bank of America card, but if he was one of the people that might have been tagged and flagged by the FBI. He was, I believe, in a meeting with the vice president, but I could be wrong on that. But just imagine if you're there on business, you were there wanting to tour the Capitol, you maybe did want to go and hear the president speak, or you want to just go to the Air and Space Museum, and you use a Bank of America card, guess what? You got flagged because the second largest bank in the country turned over your data to the FBI. And so right now you've had all sorts of customers calling for a boycott. So that's why I posted this article, because first, the story was one thing. The response is the article we've posted here. And so you got some saying, bye-bye, Bank of America. We're no longer going to deal with you. Time to get out of Bank of America, boycott them. The customers should sue unless there's a subpoena. Anyway, we give you all of that information that you can look at yourself. Now, to be fair, the bank says, well, yes, but we're supposed to do this. And they do have what's called a Bank Secrecy Act, where they use that to detect money laundering. If you've ever tried to take out, not that I've ever done this, more than $10,000 from your savings account, you get flagged. And so there are some things like that that might be a justification. But if nothing else, I just wanted to at least mention that, because it has been floating around for a couple of days. And every once in a while I get an email saying, why is it you haven't talked about, and it would be, why haven't you talked about the Bank of America boycott? Well, we now have talked about that. We'll bring it up again a little bit later, and it brings us into other issues we will be discussing. But when we come back from the break, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about this Gender Policy Council, transgenderism, feminism, and all sorts of issues that are surfacing in the Biden administration. So stay tuned. We'll talk about that right after these messages.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View.
And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and over the next couple of hours, we're going to cover a lot of different topics. Some of those have to do with various executive orders written by and signed by President Biden. About 50 of them now, and we're going to look at a couple. One, in just a minute, we're going to talk about this idea of a gender policy council and some of the issues of transgenderism and everything. We'll get into some of that. And then in the next hour, we'll be talking about the issue of immigration, and Dr. Carol Swain will be with us. Of course, we'll also be talking to her about, of course, the fact it's Black History Month, and we'll get into some of the involvement she's had in the 1776 project. But primarily, our commission will spend most of our time talking about some of the issues of immigration policy. Of course, we have an impeachment trial taking place right now. So our first article is by Jonathan Turley, a law professor of George Washington University. We'll get into that. We also have an action item dealing with the issue of election reform, which we'll talk about. So there are a lot of issues that we will be discussing. But starting us off, we go to an individual that's been on the program with us before, Dr. Warren Farrell, individual that we had on as we talked about his book, The Boy Crisis, Why Our Boys Are Struggling and What We Can Do About It. You may be familiar with some of his other very famous books, The Myth of Male Power, Why Men Are the Way They Are. We've also mentioned he's perhaps the only man in the country that's ever been elected 3 times to the board of directors of the National Organization for Women. But more recently, he's had some questions and concerns about this Gender Policy Council. So we thought we would spend some time talking with him. So, Dr. Farrell, welcome back to Point of View.
Oh, I'm really looking forward to talking to you again. I enjoyed our last interview a lot.
And I, again, would recognize you and I might, and some of our audience might disagree a little bit, but when we come to this is interesting because this new Gender Policy Council is one that is supposed to be helpful in terms of dealing with sex, gender, and all the rest, but you actually feel it may be going in the wrong direction. Why?
Well, and very briefly, I feel it's both sexist and racist. And it's sexist and racist because here it doesn't include boys and it doesn't include men. And so here Biden is talking about, President Biden is talking about the importance of unity, but he's exacerbating the division between the sexes. He's talking about the importance of diversity. Well, this means that males who are black, who are Hispanic, who are gay, who are trans, they are all left out of the Gender Policy Council because the Gender Policy Council, as President Biden has formed it, is exclusively for girls and for women, not for boys and men. It completely ignores, so it ignores in that sense diversity. It ignores and avoids equity, which is a Biden, a key word for President Biden. And, of course, it isn't inclusive. And so diversity, equity, inclusion, and unity, the 4 key words that Biden rests on, it violates all of those. It's sexist because it's sexist to call something gender and leave out either gender. And Biden has done exactly that, and it's racist. It's racist because when you think about black communities, and he says Black Lives Matter, but black communities, the major problems in black communities is the lack of fathers, and from the lack of fathers comes the black males being much more likely to be prisoners, much more likely to be the street homeless, much more likely to be the targets of police shootings. So with police who shoot blacks shoot males 24 times as often as they shoot females. Driving while black implicitly means driving while black male. So to avoid to say you care about blacks and avoid the blacks who are having the most problems, and to exclude them from being considered and worked with, is just hypocritical, and it takes sexism and adds sexism to racism. And there would be one argument about that if he hadn't said that the mission of the two missions of the Gender Policy Council is to mitigate sexism and mitigate racism, but instead of mitigating it, he's exacerbating it.
Well, and again, as you've pointed out in your book, The Boy Crisis, the big issue is with the boys and males. As you said in passing, but let's come back to that for just a minute, because I want to reemphasize that. If you're concerned about the black community, and we're going to be talking about some of that later next hour, there is a striking difference, as you point out, between the situation with black males and black females in terms of racial injustice, in terms of prisoner population, in terms of the homeless. So when you leave males out, even on the race issue, you're missing perhaps the biggest issue that so oftentimes even isn't discussed. Fair?
Absolutely, very fair. There's no group that is more in danger in America than black males. But most people don't understand about that is that it isn't all black males. It is the black males who have not had significant father involvement. This is on the one hand, this was a very when I presented the proposal for the Boy Crisis book to my publisher, I had 10 areas of causes of the boy crisis outlined, but that was before I deeply researched it. 14 years later, when I was finished the research and writing, all the other causes of the boy crisis had evaporated in comparison to the lack of father involvement. And I realized also that I wasn't the first person to put my finger on this. That Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was a U.S. Senator, who was both Republican and Democratic presidential supporter of and a sociologist, he was in 1965. He did a study of inner city crime, and people were afraid that he was going to be, sort of coming out with this conclusion of it's because of blacks. And what he found was it wasn't because of blacks per se. It was because it was only in that 25% of the black community where there is what I call dad deprivation, where there was minimal or no involvement on the part of fathers in the children's families. Well, that 25% figure in the black community is now over 70%. And at the time, 1965, of the Moynihan Report, what the figure was in the Caucasian community was 3.2% of children being raised did not have a significant amount of father involvement. Today, it is now 35%. So it is significantly higher today in the Caucasian community, lack of father involvement for boys, than it was in the black community at the time of the Moynihan Report in 1965.
Well, we're talking with Dr. Warren Farrell. We'll come back and continue that because we've really kind of taken a little bit of an angle on the race issue. But let's come back to the issue of, again, gender liberation for men and women. And the fact is what you have is this Gender Policy Council has some unintended consequences that we'll talk about as well. And, of course, if you have a comment or question, 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Warren Farrell, best known probably more Farrell recently for his book, A Boy Crisis, but he's written many others, and we have information about him on our website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The political divisions in America are evident to just about anyone, which leads to a sincere question. Are there any issues with significant bipartisan support? Actually, there are quite a number, as George Barna discovered in a post-election survey. As he surveyed Republicans and Democrats, he found a half dozen issues that are supported by a supermajority of voters in both parties. Americans may be divided, but you can still find issues which voters support in overwhelming numbers. More than 4 out of 5 Americans support the idea of expanding the domestic manufacturing base. 4 out of 5 adults support the notion of investing heavily in the improvement of our national infrastructure. Making Social Security and Medicare financially solvent is another bipartisan issue. 8 out of 10 adults back such a concept. Reducing the federal debt is another popular idea for 3/4 of adults. Likewise, reducing the federal income taxes for individuals also appeals to nearly 3/4 of adults. A large majority of Americans want to give parents more school choices for their children. By contrast, George Barna found a clear lack of bipartisan support for many of the key issues in the Biden administration agenda. That would be such items as increasing the number of U.S. Supreme Court judges from 9 to 13 and eliminating the use of fossil fuels as part of the Green New Deal. If you look at his polling results, you realize that there are many important issues where Republican voters and Democrat voters can find common ground, but few of those issues are being promoted. Often it seems to me that many of our political leaders want to increase conflict and polarization rather than solve problems that have overwhelming support. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, privileged to have with us just a little bit longer Dr. Warren Farrell. First of all, I want to encourage you to get his book, The Boy Crisis, one that we have talked about before. I even did a commentary on it after we did an extensive interview with him on the subject, and you can certainly find it in your local bookstore, but we have information about him and all of that on our website, pointofview.net. We talked about the kind of the racism part of it, although that's still relevant, but what about the sexism part of it? It does seem to me that if you're really concerned about gender liberation, which is a phrase used oftentimes by progressives, when you only focus on girls and women, I think you leave a lot of people out. What's your thoughts?
Absolutely. You leave a lot of people out, and you also leave out, China, probably the least transparent of leading nations, has already acknowledged that there's a boy crisis in China. And when you acknowledge, when you understand that there's a boy crisis, you understand that there's, when boys in the 53 largest developed nations are falling behind girls in all academic subjects, but especially in reading and writing, which are the two biggest predictors of success or failure, you are really undermining the future of boys to be productive. So today, you have boys dropping out of high school about twice the rate of girls, and boys who drop out of high school before COVID, when the unemployment rate was 3.5%, the unemployment rate among boys who dropped out of high school was in their 20s was over 20%. So you have, and of course, if you're dropping out of high school and and you're unemployed, and boys today are 66% more likely than girls, than their sisters, to live in their parents' basement. You don't make the world very appealing to either boys or girls. I don't know of a single. Coming up on Valentine's Day. I have never met a single woman who's responsive romantically to a Valentine from a young man who's living in his parents' basement, is unemployed, and has dropped out of high school. This is not exactly a female fantasy.
Yeah.
Oh, will you be the great father to my children? I love this. And so, for Biden to ignore what's happening with boys is to undermine what's happening with girls. I mean, girls need, our daughters need boys to marry who are worthy of their love. They need boys who are productive to be great fathers, to be examples for their children. They don't need boys to be in prison. They don't need boys to be unemployed. They don't need boys to be failures to launch. They don't need boys raising children by being addicted to video games instead of paying attention to the children. This is not what Biden's, and we need women to be able to have men who can reduce the burden on single moms. And so this is, Biden is a family man, and he should be the first to understand that, that the family is a bipartisan issue, that boys, that when only one sex wins, both sexes lose. And so we've taken, the Democrats and liberals have largely taken an anti-family, anti-father approach that is undermining this, the greatness of America.
Let me just real quickly talk about, as you mentioned, the pandemic. Before the pandemic, we talked with you about this time last year, and that's when the pandemic was kind of in the background. But since then, we've tried to do, and I think it's been a abject failure oftentimes, educate the entire population of young people through Zoom calls and all the rest. But getting back to your expertise looking at boys, let's face it, if you are in a home where you have parents who are going to keep you motivated, or if you are self-motivated, fine. But if you're in a home where the parents aren't as involved, or more importantly, if there's a difference between girls who will sit in front of a screen and talk and boys that want to do anything else but sit in front of a screen, unless it's a video screen, it seems to me that in some respects, the pandemic, the lockdown, and the inability to get some students back to the schools are hurting the boys even more than girls. What's your thoughts?
That is accurate, and now we have data. We're just beginning to get data on that. But so, first of all, we all know just intuitively, and certainly the research for the boy crisis sort of reinforces that boys, as a rule, especially as teenagers, have fewer social skills. And so the COVID-related type of isolation is really increasing our son's vulnerability. And for those parents who don't know this, when boys and girls are at the age of 9, they rarely commit suicide, and their suicide rates are equal. But between the ages of 10 and 14, boys' suicide rates are twice that of girls. Between the ages of 15 and 19, boys' suicide rate is 4 times that of girls. Between the ages of 20 and 24, boys' suicide rate is a little bit more than 5 times that of girls. That's before COVID.
Wow.
With COVID, and the fewer social skills of boys, that isolation, as you said, is more powerfully impactful about boys. We know now that boys, when girls and boys break up in a serious relationship, that boys are far more likely to become depressed and become suicidal. And so part of what I hope I've done in the Boy Crisis book is to identify the 60-plus red flags of male suicide that are so important to tap into, because we've been measuring depression and suicide only true. Our social workers and psychologists focus on girls' depression and suicide indicators, and not the types of indicators that boys manifest when they're feeling depressed. So, for example, addiction to video games is one thing to watch out for. Addiction to pornography. When boys don't produce in schools, they tend to not. They tend not to be leaders. They tend not to accomplish their goals. They tend to fail in school, and so girls don't tend to date losers. They tend to date the winners among the males in school, and so boys turn to pornography and they become addicted to the types of stimuli sexually that keeps increasing and increasing until when they finally meet a young woman who is interested in possibly being with them, she feels treated like an object in a porn movie, and she withdraws, which only proves to the boy that he's not able to attract women, and he will be rejected, which then turns him back into pornography and moves him into a deeper cycle of depression and potentially suicide.
Just incredible. Well, one of the things we've talked about on this program so many times is the value of families, the value of fathers. And as you've always said, when only one sex wins, both sex loses. And so in some respects, I want to encourage people to go to your website. It's warrenfarrell.com. Don't even have to know how to spell it because we have it on our website, pointofview.net. That's where you can find some of the books on the boy crisis, the myth of male power, why men are the way that they are. But most importantly, I just appreciate you being an advocate for the problem of the fatherless America and the advocate for boys. And certainly we appreciate you being on the program. And thank you for speaking out today on the Gender Policy Council. And we always value our time with you. And thank you for joining us today on Point of View.
Thank you. The feeling is very mutual. I love the way you ask good questions and you listen well and you seem to really care.
Well, we will get you on here again. And matter of fact, we went a whole year without having him on, so we'll do that again. And by the way, you can go to about a year ago. We have that interview on the Boy Crisis book. We also have a commentary I did about a week later because I thought it was so well done, and I'll probably do a commentary on this as well. So we give you some chances to hear from an individual that, as we pointed out before, probably the only man in this country that was elected 3 times to the board of directors of the National Organization of Women. But it shows that even if we may disagree on some of these political issues, we can come to some points of common agreement, and so we wanted you to hear about that. As you go to the website and want to find out a little bit more about Dr. Warren Farrell, I want you to also look at the middle section there called Take Action. Our action item for you today is one that I've mentioned before, and that is that we have this bill called For the People Act of 2021. It's H.R. 1. There's also a companion in the Senate, Senate Bill 1. And it is very similar to the one I discussed last year and did a commentary on. It's of grave concern. If you've listened to American Family Association, you've heard Tim Wildman talking about this. If you listen to Jim Dobson, he's written about this as well. But we wanted to make it possible for you to contact your member of Congress. This is something that would require that all states have to have mail-in voting. All states must allow somebody to register to vote the day of an election. Oh, what could possibly go wrong there? It would vastly expand ballot harvesting. It actually, I'm quoting from the bill, would require that an individual be able to obtain an absentee ballot without any form of identification. So we encourage you to go to the website, and all you have to do is put in your zip code, and that will then pop up your member of the House of Representatives, and you can express your opinion to him or her, and we make that available today on Point of View. We'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let me just, if I can, over this next half hour, try to cover a few more topics before we get to Dr. Carol Swain, and we'll be talking to her just a little bit about the fact that she was on the 1776 Commission, which has been disbanded by President Biden, but then also get into the issue of immigration. Of course, there's been a ban on deportation, and then that ban has been overturned briefly through an injunction through a judge. So we'll get into some of the details about that and what immigration policy could be and should be. So there'll be all sorts of things we'll talk about with her in about a half an hour. But in this first segment here that we have, I wanted to, first of all, talk about the impeachment trial. And our first article is by Jonathan Turley, who, it's amazing how many times I end up quoting from him, but he is a professor of law at George Washington University, not a Trump fan, obviously, but nevertheless, that is something we'll be talking about. And then we'll get into a piece from Bank of America. That's the second article we've posted here, which kind of gets into our booklet on privacy and surveillance, because if you're not familiar, and I really haven't talked about this much yet, but I will mention it maybe a little bit later next hour, about the fact that there's calling for a boycott because Bank of America turned over all of the account information and records of anybody that happened to be in Washington, D.C. on January 6th. The assumption is that if you were using an ATM in Washington, D.C., if you were in a hotel in Washington, D.C., if you had any kind of function there. Maybe you were a tourist, or I think even in that day, Kelly Shackelford, who is oftentimes with us on Friday, I think he was in Washington, D.C. that day. They turned over all of that information to the FBI. And then they began to then question, at least last week, one, I don't know how many since then, that were to actually be looked at to see if they were involved in any way into the storming of the Capitol. So this might have involved some of the people that were in the Capitol, could have involved a whole bunch of people that were listening to the president, could have involved a number of other people that were just there and nevertheless used a Bank of America card. And so we'll get into that because it gets us into that issue of privacy and surveillance. And that is a booklet I've got holding up right now that we have made available in the past. Some of these booklets I'm just going to have to update because there's just been so many intrusions in privacy. My booklet, for example, on immigration that we'll be talking about briefly with Carol Swain probably needs to be updated a little bit. Some of the ones on social media and a variety of others certainly need to be updated just because of all the things that have happened within just the last year or two. Let me, though, give you a little bit of an overview of some others because while we're talking about the intrusion of our privacy, this case came from the Bank of America, but in other cases it comes from big tech. So one of the other articles that we have posted here is by Rachel Bovard, who's been on the program with us. She's been both in studio and recently by phone. It's time for conservatives to take on big tech tyrants. And it's so interesting because that relates very much to the fact that, as I mentioned just the other day, there is this very good piece by Senator Ron Johnson about YouTube actually canceling the U.S. Senate. Now, Ron Johnson, if you're not familiar, is a senator from Wisconsin. What he's talking about is that all of the testimony from physicians about treating COVID-19 patients was taken off. Okay, when's the last time Senate testimony was not allowed to be on YouTube? I can't think of a time, and this all gets back to the issue of hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, which I talked about the other day. So it's the old idea of YouTube canceling the U.S. Senate, and one of the other ones by our friend Matt Walsh, stop apologizing to the cancel culture mob, which maybe I'll try to get to next hour. So they're just a couple of things that we will try to put on the table here. And if I don't get to all of those, let me encourage you to go and print these out and to read them. They are our attempt to try to find some of the articles we think are most relevant to what is taking place. And although there's going to be almost exclusive coverage of the trial, the impeachment trial taking place, as I've always pointed out, some of the most important things happen not with those particular high-profile events, but some things happening on the periphery, and so that's why we talk about that. Don't forget, of course, we also have an action item for you to express your opinion to your elected representative in the House of Representatives. about For the People Act of 2021. If you find yourself saying, well, I hate to admit it, Kerby, but I don't know who my representative is, that's why we make it so easy for you. Just click on that particular button there that says Take Action, and then you scroll down. If there's a place for you to put in your zip code, and I'll type it in right now, and then it pops up the information you need to add. Your zip code may not be enough for us to identify your representative, so we need your address and some things, and then it actually gives you a suggested letter. Now, you can edit it any way you want, but it has 3 paragraphs and some great information there that you can use to educate your representative or simply to express your opinion on that. And I've had lots of people say, I'll be honest, I never contacted my representative, but you've just made it so easy, and we have today. So our action item is to contact your representative about this issue of so-called election reform, which I think goes in the wrong direction. But we will be hearing quite a bit today and over the next couple of days, the statement that the reckless rhetoric by President Donald Trump was enough to justify an insurrection against the people and against Congress and led to the storming of the Capitol. First of all, let's recognize, as Jonathan Turley, who is a lawyer, points out, that there are all sorts of individuals, no doubt, and he gives you quite a long list of individuals who have engaged in what we would all call reckless rhetoric, but none of those individuals should be charged with a crime, even if they said some things they probably should not have said. But from a legal point of view, you have to recognize that the president, if he did use some words like fight, also added to this a section that he puts in here. Everyone here should be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard. And if nothing else, that is, I think, a good disclaimer. But even if it was not, in his 3rd paragraph, or maybe I guess it's about the 5th paragraph, if you want to try to find it exactly, you then have Jonathan Turley, law professor, school you on the law. And what he does is actually point out that first of all, the article of impeachment does not charge him with recklessly causing riots or threats to Congress. It causes him with incitement. And the word incitement does have a legal term. I did a commentary last week, and if you want to find it, you can simply go to pointofview.net, go to our search function in the lower left-hand corner, type incitement, and you can read that, because I go into all the Supreme Court cases, but in this particular case, what you have is Jonathan Turley taking you on one of the cases, which is called Brandenburg versus Ohio. But whether you look at that case or another case, one involving a leader of the Ku Klux Klan, that actually seemed to call for a violent action, that was dismissed by the Supreme Court. And then the next year took on another case, and this is where there was an attempt to charge leaders of the NAACP because they had used what some people thought were over-the-top rhetoric calling for a boycott of businesses, and later there was an arson attempt against those businesses. And in both cases, the Supreme Court, refused to allow the government to criminalize in any kind of speech, even when it calls for force, unless it was imminent force. So it's a very, very high bar that is used. And so this is why the title of this piece by Jonathan Turley is Reckless Rhetoric is a Reckless Standard for This Impeachment. Then he does a little bit of course, whataboutism, and I've never felt that that's the best argument, but it's good to remind ourselves that he talks about Maxine Waters called for people to confront Republicans in public. Ariana Presley insisted that these violent marches last year were needed, and they needed to have unrest in the streets. Kamala Harris claimed that protesters should not give up or not let up, even though they had become violent. Nancy Pelosi condemned fellow lawmakers as traitors and the enemy within. He then goes in and talks about Chuck Schumer, probably the best-known piece, in which he stands in front of the Supreme Court saying, "Hey, Gorsuch, hey, Kavanaugh, you have unleashed a whirlwind, and you're going to pay pay the price. Cori Bush seemed to defend the recent takeover of a St. Louis prison in a tweet about riots are the language of the unheard. Gretchen Whitmer defended state lawmaker Cynthia Johnson for calling for soldiers to make Trump supporters pay for harassing her. James Comey talks about the Republican Party needs to be burned down. Jennifer Rubin says we have to collectively, in essence, burn down the Republican Party. It goes through this long, long list, and it is a long list indeed. And if nothing else, it is something that even though I'd like you to read it, I wish at least some of the senators would read it and rethink this whole issue of incitement, because it takes us in the wrong direction. Let's take a break, though. We'll be back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
One of the other articles we posted on the website is by Rachel Bovard, and it relates a lot to this booklet on social media that we make available. Spent half the time in that booklet just talking about the impact of social media having on our brains, and then the other half on social media censorship. Probably just need a whole booklet now on social media censorship because it has developed so significantly. But if you want to kind of get an overview, this goes on for a number of pages. I believe there's about 5 pages in this by Rachel Bovard, and it was actually posted on a website that is pretty much accessed only by people in the state of Texas. So I wanted to give it some national play because I think she's done a very good job of describing that. Last time we posted her piece, it was in USA Today, and you recognize that USA Today is going to have a word limit, number one, and they probably aren't going to allow her to say all the things she wants to say anyway because of maybe their attempt to try to appeal to the audience that that newspaper is intended for. So in this one, you get, I think, a fuller exposition by Rachel Bovard, and she is an individual, as I've said before, who's been on this program, and it is one that maybe you would like to read as an individual that works with the Conservative Partnership Institute. But she, first of all, talks about the fact that there is really a need to begin to take on what she calls the big tech tyrants. She uses a quote from Ernest Hemingway. Gotta love this, you know. There's a person in The Sun Also Rises called Mike, in which they ask him how he went bankrupt, and he said, well, gradually, then all at once. And the point she's making is this. First, you know, they were maybe giving... She doesn't say this, but I would say, you know, Mike Huckabee, he got deplatformed for a day or two when he was talking about a Chick-fil-A day and a few things like that. And there was a little bit here and a little bit there. But then all of a sudden, they banned the President of the United States from every conceivable platform, she says. And then they came for everyone else, even some of the other conservative groups. And so it kind of grew a little bit and then happened all at once. If you want to use another illustration rather than Ernest Hemingway, how about a roller coaster? You know, when you're going on a roller coaster, it's kind of slow, tick, 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 and you get at the very top, and all of a sudden, you know, and that's kind of how it's happening. Whereas before, we had a couple of examples in our social media booklet of censorship. Now, I mean, it's almost every day, and I won't try to go into all the ones she posts, but they are rather significant. And so then she points out that some of these bans really are head scratchers. One of the things she talks about here is they've had bans on outlets selling patriotic clothing. Or, for example, they pulled the Facebook page of former Representative Ron Paul. That would be the father of Rand Paul. And then later said, well, that was just an error, but, you know, until people fuss about it. Of course, we have talked about how Apple, Google, and Amazon acted in concert to take out Parler, and it has been something that they've had to work really hard to try to find servers where they could get back up. Then she says it isn't just an effort by the big tech platforms, although she says they have the most muscle to implement it. She says in a dramatic example of power from corporate America has been able to cut off people as well, because President Donald Trump has been cut off from two of his banks. Stripe, a credit card processing app, will no longer transact anybody associated with his former campaign. Shopify will no longer sell the wares, the campaign wares. Salesforce will no longer send emails for the Trump campaign or for the Republican National Committee. I mean, you can kind of see where this goes. The email service, which maybe you've used, MailChimp, is already banning certain users from using that. Mozilla, the nonprofit behind Firefox, has said that they want to deplatform many bad actors. According to one of the ones where Mozilla was giving a long list of a good number of people that we've had on this program, for example. And so, as she says, as conservatives flock to encrypted chat apps like Signal and Telegram, many of these left-wing groups are then trying to figure out a way to ban them as well. So she goes through kind of a long list, and I won't wear you out with those, to show that we're talking about more now than just Twitter and Facebook. And then she says that, if nothing else, this crackdown from big tech has been clarifying, because it's helped people recognize this isn't just a few people whining. She talks about one individual who was criticizing conservatives for whining about social media, but having little in the way of solutions. Well, this is more than just a few people whining about it now. It's gotten pretty significant, in which she says, again, we're talking about now digital era monopolies in their market power and influence that rival what she calls the Gilded Age of the trusts and trust busters and cartels and other things, and then goes through some of the things that probably need to take place. So it is a very lengthy piece by Rachel Bovard, and if you are concerned about social media censorship, I would commend that particular article to you. It's the second from the last in there. We will probably get to the last one I mentioned on cancel culture and also the one on Boy Scouts. But just before we take a break, let me also mention that another group that has found themselves canceled is the United States Senate. This comes from Senator Ron Johnson, who is a senator from Wisconsin, points out that they had testimony on December 8th, the Committee on Homeland Security. This is testimony by Dr. Pierre Corey, and what he was doing in that particular presentation, it was talking about how some have been using ivermectin, a cheap and widely available drug. It's been used in the past to treat tropical diseases caused by parasites and other things, but it was used to actually treat early treatment of COVID-19. He talked about a study that was done in Argentina. 800 healthcare workers, 400 received ivermectin, 400 did not. The ones that did not receive it, percentage, and I can go through all the numbers, but, ultimately it was talking about how successful it was. Well, back in December, there was an attempt to say, well, we aren't going to recognize ivermectin. By January, of course, now the NIH changed its guidelines. They don't necessarily endorse it, but they don't necessarily argue against it. But that's okay. YouTube pulled it off anyway. And so before actually YouTube pulled it off, Senator Johnson says that about 8 million people saw his opening statement, but unfortunately YouTube just says, nope, we're not even going to keep that there. So say something about hydroxychloroquine, say something about ivermectin, and you can be censored and you can be removed from any kind of information that would be available to the general public. Even though the NIH won't necessarily endorse it, they aren't against it, but that's enough to get pulled off of YouTube. And it illustrates, again, some of the almost inscrutable power and unpredictable power of some of the big tech giants. So, again, that's just one more illustration that Rachel Bovard doesn't have, but this appeared in a very good piece that came out more recently in the Wall Street Journal. But just before we take a break, we are going to be talking with Dr. Carol Swain in just a few minutes. But just before we do, I want to encourage you to express your opinion about For the People Act of 2021. It would actually federalize all of our elections. All states would have to have mail-in balloting. All states would have to have automatic registration on the internet. You would be allowing individuals to literally register the same day of an election. It would vastly expand ballot harvesting. It would not require voter ID. This is moving in the wrong direction. And if you want to express your opinion about that piece of legislation, I give you that opportunity. Go to the website, pointofview.net, click on the button there that says Take Action for the People Act, and we've made it easy for you to contact your member of Congress. We'll take a break and come back with more right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View.
And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time talking with our friend, Dr. Carol Swain. You might remember her as an individual that oftentimes appears in various films with Dinesh D'Souza. In the past, we've interviewed her. We've quoted her quite often, and it has been a while since we've actually had her on the program, but we have a link to her website, carolmswain.com. Don't have to remember all that because we have the link on the website. And, of course, we mentioned her just the other day when we were talking about the 1776 Commission, of which she was a part. And unfortunately, that is one of many things that have been changed by the Biden administration, another which we'll get to a little bit later on the issue of immigration. She is an individual who holds a PhD from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, as an individual that has been a professor at Princeton and Vanderbilt and a professor of law at Vanderbilt Law School. Probably best known for a number of her books. Her book, Be the People, A Call to Reclaim America's Faith and Promise, has been re-released, so we'll talk about that. Winner of 3 national awards, and an individual that we certainly call upon when we want to understand black history, want to understand things about American history, and a little bit later we're going to talk about this issue of immigration. So, Dr. Swain, just always a great opportunity to have you here on Point of View.
Thank you so much. And I also would like to direct your listeners to my media website, which is bethepeoplenews.com.
Very good.
Bethepeoplenews.com.
And we'll do that one as well. And we'll post that in just a minute. But let's, if we can, first of all, talk about the 1776 Commission. I've written some commentaries about that. I lamented that one of the first acts by this incoming President Joe Biden was to cancel that, because I felt like the 1776 Commission was really wanting to teach good history and maybe even a counterpoint to the 1619 project of the New York Times. But since you were so integrally involved in that, can you tell us a little bit more?
Well, first of all, I did not expect the elimination of the commission to be a priority of the incoming administration, because I saw the possibility for us to be unified around truth. And it was my hope that the commission, which had a 2-year, it was a 2-year commission, that it would be able to do its work. The commission issued one report, which was released on January 18th, and that report will be published in book form. And even though President Biden signed an executive order eliminating us, we still exist.
And again, I think it is something we need to talk about as well, because unfortunately, a lot of individuals, especially young people, don't know our history, or they know a very skewed view of history. And that was one of the reasons why the commission was put together in the first place, because it just is sad to say that we today have a whole generation of young people, maybe even 2 generations of young people, that don't know much about faith and much about the founding of this country, the reason why we have checks and balances. And you were attempting, through the commission, to actually provide a counterpoint to some of the kind of teaching that's been taking place in the public schools for almost a century now.
Right. The 250th of the Declaration of Independence is coming up soon, and our report provided, a deeper understanding of our nation's founding. The New York Times 1619 project argues, that America was founded in 1619 when the first slaves were brought to America, and that racism is in our DNA. We've always been a nation of systemic racism. And part of what we have done, and we're doing with our report, was to talk about slavery and the fact, that slavery, almost every human society has had slavery. What's remarkable about America is that we eliminated slavery, and our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution had the language in it that provided the basis for us to eliminate an institution that troubled the founders. And even though many of those people were slave owners themselves, it was very clear that they were uncomfortable with that institution. They knew it had to be eliminated. We also, focused on the progress that we have made in American history and the civil rights movement, that as far as everyone being equal under the law, in the 1960s, we passed 3 major civil rights laws that addressed voting rights, equality when it came to jobs and accommodations, and those forms of legal discrimination that had been a part of our society that was eliminated under the law, and housing discrimination with the 1968 Open Housing Act. And so we created a society where there was an effort to have equal opportunity. Of course, when it comes to individual racism, that's a different kind of situation. But as far as the government, we made huge progress towards addressing what America stood for.
So again, just some great material in the commission. And as a matter of fact, as it comes out in published form, we'll certainly talk about that as well. But just before we take a break, I know one of the other things you wanted to talk about is there's an upcoming issue related to reparations. Can you kind of explain that issue and why we need to alert our audience about that?
Well, for decades now, it was under John Conyers. At one time, he would always introduce a reparations bill during every Congress. Well, a bill has been introduced that would set up a commission to study slave reparations. And it really, if you really read the bill, which I'm in the process of studying, it ties back into the 1619 project and the argument, but they really want to lay the groundwork for monetary reparations for black descendants of slaves. And we know that there are all sorts of problems connected with that. For one thing, there are no living slaves or even, no living slaves or slaveholders, no guilty parties. And blacks themselves were slaveholders in some parts of the South. And it's fraught with all kinds of problems that we need to address. Plus, it would not do anything to resolve the conditions that affect black communities and hold black people back.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we will maybe, as we know a little bit more, make that an action item. Our action item today is the For the People Act, H.R. 1, so we have that. But when we come back, we want to talk about the subject of immigration, because Dr. Carol Swain has certainly been an expert in that regard, and I've watched various panels he's been on in the past. And part of this has to do with the fact that this administration wants to seemingly open the doors. We've also been talking about the fact that right here in the state of Texas, Judge Drew Tipton actually originally instituted a 14-day restraining order against the attempt to actually ban deportation. He's now added an additional 14 days to that. That was a lawsuit brought by Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton. So that's where we find ourselves in the issue of deportation. But again, it relates very much to some of the material in this booklet that we have on a biblical view of immigration. We'll talk about that with Dr. Carol Swain right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The political divisions in America are evident to just about anyone, which leads to a sincere question. Are there any issues with significant bipartisan support? Actually, there are quite a number, as George Barna discovered in a post-election survey. As he surveyed Republicans and Democrats, he found a half dozen issues that are supported by a supermajority of voters in both parties. Americans may be divided, but you can still find issues which voters support in overwhelming numbers. More than 4 out of 5 Americans support the idea of expanding the domestic manufacturing base. 4 out of 5 adults support the notion of investing heavily in the improvement of our national infrastructure. Making Social Security and Medicare financially solvent is another bipartisan issue. 8 out of 10 adults back such a concept. Reducing the federal debt is another popular idea for 3/4 of adults. Likewise, reducing the federal income taxes for individuals also appeals to nearly 3/4 of adults. A large majority of Americans want to give parents more school choices for their children. By contrast, George Barna found a clear lack of bipartisan support for many of the key issues in the Biden administration agenda. That would be such items as increasing the number of U.S. Supreme Court judges from 9 to 13 and eliminating the use of fossil fuels as part of the Green New Deal. If you look at his polling results, you realize that there are many important issues where Republican voters and Democrat voters can find common ground. But few of those issues are being promoted. Often it seems to me that many of our political leaders want to increase conflict and polarization rather than solve problems that have overwhelming support. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Dr. Carol Swain, and if you would like to join us, we'll give you that opportunity a bit later. We got some difficulty with our phones, so I do want to postpone that opportunity, but we will try to see if we can solve all that and take your calls a little bit later. But let's get into this issue of immigration. I know it's a huge topic, but maybe I'll start by saying one of the things I think we've learned, Dr. Swain, is if nothing else, that this idea of comprehensive immigration reform, whether it's comprehensive medical reform or healthcare reform or anything else, never works. But there are some very significant issues with our immigration system. Number one, it almost seems more difficult than it need to be for us to bring in people who we want to be citizens of the United States. And as you start seeing this administration no longer wanting to build the wall, maybe even taking it down, we sometimes make it a little too easy for people to come here illegally. And so then they're sort of in the shadows. There's never an opportunity for them to actually even become full citizens. And the problem of immigration has been around for decades. And yet this is an opportunity for the Biden administration, having both the House and the Senate, to bring about some kind of change. So what do you see in the future for immigration? And what are some maybe basic principles that we need to think about as this debate starts and takes place right before our eyes?
Well, one of the things you may not know is that I published an edited book debating immigration in 2018, and the book looks at all of the issues that relate to immigration, the biblical worldview, because a lot of Christians are divided. There are some that argue that you have to let everyone in, and then there are others that lay out the case for the rule of law. And so whether we're talking about the workplace or human trafficking, that's a huge problem that's related to immigration when you have open doors and the assimilation of people. We've had a problem with refugees, so many coming in that they're not able to be successful because they don't get government support for long enough to actually stand on their feet. I think to get like 8 months. And then the responsibility for caring for them is put on the communities where they are relocated. And so there are lots of issues that relate to immigration, and I think that people that want to be able to engage in a debate or talk with our legislators, they need to become acquainted with the language that's being used, as well as all the areas where immigration is impacted when it comes to American life.
It seems to me that there are certain things that are not helpful. One of those is saying, well, we'll just no longer put up a fence, we'll no longer put up a wall, we'll no longer control our borders. Another one is we've been hearing about the defund the police, but again, the idea of abolish ICE. It does seem to me that we are not being well served by even some of the rhetoric out there on the streets or even some of the things coming from the Oval Office. What are your thoughts?
No, but I mean, the people that are globalists have always wanted to erase borders between Mexico and Canada. And so not having a wall is consistent with that. It floods the country with cheap labor, and big employers, some of them are Republicans, they benefit from that, and that's why we find Democrats and Republicans unable to move ahead. Like when the Republicans had the House, the Senate, and the presidency, they have not been able to pass legislation, and so this issue has been a perennial issue for American society. The last time we had a serious overhaul was 1986.
And again, that's under Ronald Reagan. And again, there were all sorts of promises that we would eventually resolve the issue. And here we are in 2021 still talking about that. You did mention the biblical idea. And from your book, I thought we might spend a moment because a lot of Christians are trying to think about the fact of immigration. And I say that there are two issues. Number one, it's the whole issue of the rule of law. So in one case, you certainly see in Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2 and others of the need for us to be subject to governing authorities or to submit ourselves to every human institution. So we do have borders, we do have nations, we always have had that, and a nation that does not have borders really is not a nation. So we can talk about kind of the legal issue, which is one part, but the second part of that is compassion. Certainly in the Old Testament, there were admonitions for even Israel to treat aliens with respect and not to oppress the foreigner and those kinds of things. So there is a sense in which, on the one hand, we want to have our biblical convictions about law and rule of order, but we also want to have our biblical compassion about individuals that come here seeking asylum. And so in some respects, those are the kinds of things I know that you've addressed in the past about how to think about this biblically. And if we sort those out, then I think we can begin to at least have some ideas about what kind of legislation we could support in the future on this issue of immigration, don't you think?
I agree. And again, Debating Immigration has essays that cover all of this. And people who are Christian that are trying to think their way through this issue, they need to understand in ancient Israel who was the alien. And people that have researched it would say that it was more like a resident alien in the U.S. in the sense that it was people who were here legally. And in ancient Israel, the foreigners had to follow the laws of that society. So they couldn't just come into Israel and do what they wanted. They were expected to obey the laws. And in America, we have lost sense of that.
Right. And that's part of the issue of what you talked about in terms of assimilation. I've said before, Dr. Swain, that sometimes we meet individuals that are naturalized citizens. They've had to take a citizenship test, and they, in some respects, seem to know more about our history and our political system than even those in this country that we're born here. I've even said maybe it'd be worthwhile requiring that some individuals in various states think about maybe requiring a citizenship test given to all of our graduating seniors, see how they do, because in some respects, those that have been naturalized have. But when you have millions and millions, I mean, I don't know how many tens of millions we have here now illegally. I always say 11 million, but I know it's more than that. We don't have assimilation, and we don't have the kinds of things that were established in, for example, the Old Testament, where you had to live by the rules and the laws of the theocracy at the time. So that seems to be another key issue that we have to address here in the 21st century.
And as far as how many, ever since I've been studying immigration, and we're talking about over 30 years, I've been a political scientist looking at American politics, they've said 11 million. And there have been studies from major universities that would put the actual number close to 30 million. So when Joe Biden or whoever's in office is talking about legalizing the people who are already here, don't believe the 11 million. It would be far more that would be eligible. And also, when there's a change of administration, we already see this, you get the caravans that come in. And so when you have a liberal administration in office, that encourages more people to come illegally, and it creates a tremendous burden on law enforcement and on the communities where they settle.
Well, again, let me just encourage people that if they would like to, we'll put a link up there to Debating Immigration. It came out a number of years ago, as you pointed out, Cambridge University Press, about 300-plus pages. You were the editor of it, and that is one resource that's available. Of course, we also have this booklet we make available, and if nothing else, I thank you for being at the forefront on this issue of immigration. But again, we've almost come back to full circle. If we could do a good job of educating those that come into this country and help them understand the foundations of this country, which are found in some of the material of the 1776 Commission, we'd be a lot better off. But I'm sure we'll be coming back to this time and time again. But I appreciate you giving us some time today in your busy schedule. And again, we have a link to your websites that we're putting up right now. We already have the one for your personal website. We'll put up the other one so people can follow you. And thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
And the immigration book is 2018. It's newly updated.
Very good. It is 2018, and again, we'll probably be talking about that in the future. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, last half hour, we'll get into a couple of other issues in the news. We have, of course, talked about the trial on immigration. We'll get into this issue of Bank of America, which is getting us into the issue of privacy and surveillance. And also, one of the other articles I've posted by Matt Walsh, Stop Apologizing to the Cancel Culture Mob. So all of those topics are relevant. And if you would certainly like to join us in this last half hour, we'll see if we can solve some of our phone issues, which kind of caught us off guard. We'll give you that opportunity. In the meantime, don't forget, we have an action item, and it has to do with letting your elected representatives know what you think about the For the People Act of 2021. It's at our website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me just mention, one of the things that we have encouraged you to do is to take the time to actually spend a little bit of time going to the Take Action item. And the Take Action item is, again, about this issue of election reform. And so that is something that we are going to be addressing. And again, I would love to know, even as we're talking about this, whether or not we're going to continue on. What are we going to do? Or do we have a guest on this online or something like that? Somebody help me out. Okay. We have so many strange things going on the computer here. I wasn't sure. Okay. The point I want to make real quickly is we have the opportunity for you to take an action item, and it's called the For the People Act of 2021. And if you have not taken the time to deal with that particular issue, I would encourage you to do so, because we'll probably move on to some others in maybe today or certainly tomorrow. So if you would like to contact your representative, that is something we encourage you to do. I'm just, again, amazed that it was able to pass last time, in which it would have federalized our election system. And our system of elections are actually a series of state elections that all become a national election, but instead this would require states to have automatic registration of the vote. Anyone could actually register to vote on the same day as an election. That's, of course, as dangerous as it can be. The state, quote, may not require an individual to provide any form of identification as a condition of obtaining an absentee ballot. And, of course, it would eventually get rid of voter ID. It would expand voter ballot harvesting, and much, much more. So anyway, just trying to give you that opportunity to express your opinion. But I want to get to the other articles that we have posted on the website in this last half hour, 1-800-351-1212. And Matt Walsh has been on the program with us, but he's written a very good piece on Stop Apologizing to the Cancel Culture Mob. I thought it was appropriate because some of these individuals who have been canceled recently use the N-word, and it kind of relates a little bit to the conversation we had with Dr. Carol Swain just a minute ago. I'll just read the first paragraph because you'll get the idea. He says, this past week was one of the cancel culture's busiest and most productive to date. It began with the country superstar Morgan Wallen getting suspended by his record label, pulled from hundreds of radio stations, and disqualified from receiving country music awards after he was caught saying the N-word. It ended with Donald McNeil Jr., who is a very well-known science reporter and veteran journalist for 45 years, who was essentially forced out of his job at the New York Times after a revelation that he used a similar word. And in between, there were other odd accusations of inappropriate behavior by other New York Times staff members. Now, I won't focus on all of these because in some respects, I think Morgan Wallen did it while he was drunk, and maybe the lesson to be learned there is never get drunk, so that you're saying something stupid that then is heard by somebody else, is recorded. Because everybody's carrying a tape recorder now with their cell phone, you can say some really stupid things in a drunken state that you would regret later on. So there's the application here. But I did want to focus, because Matt Walsh spends a little bit of time explaining Donald McNeil. This is a really bright individual, a science reporter and a journalist that had been practicing this for 45 years. So get that in your head, an individual being forced out of his job in New York Times. Now, did he use the N-word? Well, apparently, if the story is correct, that a number of years ago when he was on a trip with some students, one of the students was complaining about someone had said that word to him. And so in trying to carry on the conversation, he didn't use it as a slur, but simply referred to it because he thought a classmate of hers should have been suspended for a video made by a 12-year-old in which she used that word. Okay, we all know what the word is. And so this is really one of those so convoluted, it's really hard to even imagine anything took place. Because then that happened 2 years ago, and then it now surfaced. Well, when it surfaced 2 years after the fact, you then had those at the New York Times say, wait a minute, this is, not an attempt to demean someone, use it in a racial way. He just simply repeated the word, but didn't use it in a negative way. But then, almost immediately, it says here by Matt Walsh, the brass at Times, New York Times, lost its nerve. And then you had the social media mob where then they jumped in, and then there were 150 staffers at the New York Times who sent a letter to the leadership professing to be outraged and in pain because someone had referred to a racial slur years ago. So, of course, he talks about how very quickly the leaders in the New York Times actually folded like a folding chair. And the point he was simply saying is that this was, if all the story is true, and of course you always have to add that if all the story is true, this is really reaching very far for a possible offense. So what Matt Walsh says is, the whole question is that we should not always cater to someone who is upset by how a word is used. He said, I should rephrase. It is not that feeling matters more than intent. That would assume that those 150 staff members who said they were in pain because of a word Donald McNeil said 2 years ago were being sincere, but that is almost certainly not the case, he says. He says one of the hallmarks of the cancel culture, which makes it distinct and modern, is that the angry pitchfork mob is rarely angry. They ruin lives, reputations, and careers as a matter of course, more indifferent to the victims than angry at them. They're motivated by cruelty, callousness, and ideological conviction, and empowered by the institutions that run our society. He says, if you think about it, you really cannot cancel anyone, that is, turn them into social and professional pariahs, unless you control the institutions and culture itself. He spends a little bit of time talking about one particular case where people that were conservative were objecting about something Nick Cannon said, and yet he was reinstated, because he really says that the cancel culture is inherently a left-wing phenomenon. Now, every once in a while you get a pushback from that. You'll have somebody say, well, wait a minute, conservatives have a cancel culture too. And I always say, okay, what example do you have? The one I hear most often is Colin Kaepernick. Okay, if you want to say that Colin Kaepernick didn't get an opportunity to be in the NFL because we have conservative owners that wanted to cancel himself, okay. First of all, I'm not sure all the NFL owners are conservative, first of all. Second of all, I've noticed how many times they're willing to turn a blind eye to even individuals that have rap sheets as long as your arm, and still, if they can play, they get to go in there. But okay, if you want to use that as your one example. But the point that I think Matt Walsh is using is that cancel culture is primarily a left-wing phenomenon. Why? Because the left wing controls the academy, that is, universities. The left wing pretty much controls entertainment. The left wing controls most of news. The left wing controls most of social media. And so that's where the cancel culture really is seen. And again, he says there is one other point he wanted to make, and that is, what is cancel culture not? Well, it is the opposite by definition of forgiving and merciful. It is precisely, he says, why groveling public apologies from its victims are so impotent as they were in the most recent examples. And he gives an example of our country western star that actually went nowhere. And so he concludes by simply saying, you know, what Donald McNeil should have said is the truth. As an adult, as a professional, as a human with a rational brain, he knew that in the past and still knows that the context matters when it comes to language and anything else. But he also knows that his colleagues who lined up to stab him in the back and feed him to the wolves after nearly 5 decades in the business are not deserving an apology. They're the ones who apologize for him for their wretched and manipulative behavior. And so he concludes by simply saying, look, there are times when we should apologize. Of course, that's a Christian thing to do, but that's in the right context. But he finishes by saying, don't pretend to care about the emotional well-being of sociopaths who want to destroy you for fun. Many people in your life may deserve apologies for many things, but not the mob. Never them. Stop apologizing. It's a very lengthy piece. I gave you a short summary of it, but it reminds us again where the culture is and where the cancel culture is, what it is and what it is not. Very good piece by Matt Walsh. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. If you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Joanne in Colorado, KTGW, thank you for joining us today. I think you'd like to speak to the issue of media bias. What would you like to add?
Yes, I have a friend who's a West Point graduate, served his country, and is an IT person. He heard about Tucker Carlson's talking about the Bank America issue where they turned everybody's information over to the FBI, and he wanted to listen to or watch the program. So he searched on the internet, and he found what he thought was it. He clicked on it, and when he did, it was like his computer froze. And he tried taking off cookies, and he tried shutting it down and rebooting. And finally, he couldn't access his email. So he turned it off, left it off for an hour, and when he did get it back up, his email was there. And I just talked to him a while ago. He said subsequent to that, he has been able to read what Tucker Carlson said, but he has not been able to view the broadcast. And it just seems like Big Brother's really watching.
Well, again, I was just doing this right now. If he wants to use the link that we have a link here, and it's the, I think the third article, Bank of America FBI boycott. And then if you go to the highlighted part, the HDMI part, it will take you to Fox News Tucker Carlson. So maybe coming in, if you will, the side door will allow you to see that, and you can actually watch it. But again, you can also read the entire written commentary. But for people that aren't familiar with that, let me just mention real quickly, it had to do with the fact, as I've mentioned before, that Bank of America provided the information to the FBI of all the individuals that have used a Bank of America card, whether it was an ATM machine, whether it was to eat at a restaurant, whether it was to be in a hotel. And then they narrowed it down to about 211 people. At least at the time, Tucker Carlson talked about somebody who was brought in for questioning. I don't know how many have been brought in since then. And so we've posted that article about the calls from some of the customers to boycott Bank of America. But you do have to wonder, is it a problem with the internet, or is somebody out there fiddling with it? So I don't know. But I wanted to make that available, so if people wanted to, for example, read what Tucker Carlson said or read the reaction of various customers to Bank of America, second largest bank in the country, we've posted that on the website, pointofview.net. But I think you have another story, too, don't you?
Yes, I do. Another friend of mine really likes Dr. Mercola. I believe he's sort of a naturopath. And she liked an article he had. He may have been a little bit cautious about the vaccine, but he certainly was candid about COVID. So she sent it to some doctor friends of hers, and then a day or so later she clicked on it, and she got this big red and white warning across her screen. I can't tell you exactly what it said, but it kind of weirded her out. As if, you don't want to read this, you could be influenced by it or something.
Wow. Again, it kind of gets back to one of the articles I've posted. I think it's our third article, Take on the Big Tech Tyrants, because I don't know how much is just glitches and how much is intended. But, Joanna, makes you kind of wonder about all this, doesn't it?
It certainly does. Take on the Big Tech Tyrants, you said?
Yes, that's our third article on the website, and you can read that by Rachel Bovard, and it kind of takes you into some of the kind of censorship that is taking place. Since I got a few other phone calls, let me just take some of those. But again, let me just mention the article that I mentioned. It's really our second article on Bank of America. You probably have heard the story, but I wanted to make sure I covered it today because it came out last Thursday. I think, let's give credit where credit was due. It was Fox News, Tucker Carlson, who kind of broke the story. Since then, there have been a few other people talking about it. The sad commentary is, I think I heard him say even last night, that a lot of leaders in the Democratic Party or the Republican Party aren't even talking about this. And, of course, it illustrates some of the material in our booklet on privacy and surveillance. But let me see if I can take one more phone call. May not have time for everybody, but we'll always have time tomorrow if we don't. South Carolina, the Good News Network. Dave, what would you like to add to our conversation?
Hi, Kirby. Good show today. I'd like to talk about the double standard. We have racial slurs, the N-word being used. What I find is that if conservatives or libertarians, whatever, would use such a word or racial slur, then they are immediately canceled. Yet when the left does it, nothing happens. And Bill Maher is an excellent example of this. He used the N-word, and yet he still has a job. So to me, for the left, it doesn't matter the word, it's who says it.
I think you're right on target. And again, the last article we've posted here, which is about 5 pages, if you get to that third page, that's where I appreciate Matt Walsh pointing that out, because you do have, first of all, up until fairly recently, people saying, oh, there's no such thing as a cancel culture. And then when it began to be so obvious, then you had, oh, well, there's a cancel culture on both sides. I said, okay, well, I'm willing to listen. What's the example of conservatives canceling culture? Colin Kaepernick's one I hear most often. Sometimes I'll say, well, you wanted to not get one or two of these various apps on your phone, or you decided that you weren't going to subscribe to Netflix. Well, I don't see that as cancel culture. I just see that as, you know what, I don't want to use that service anymore. So it seems to be, and I think he makes a very good case on his third page of his article, that the cancel culture is pretty much a left-wing phenomenon, because the left basically has enough control of institutions and the culture to cancel people. And then he gives you a very good example. I don't really know much about the Nick Cannon example, but he says, here's a good example of somebody that said some things which were obviously mean-spirited, racist, probably, but, he got a job back because the conservatives were complaining about it, and they go, well, why do we care about them? So I think it illustrates exactly that double standard. So thank you for bringing it up today. Let's, if we can, get into a couple of other issues. We're just about out of time, so I guess I should mention one more time before we run out of time today that what we are going to do is to encourage you to find out what your particular representative stands on the issue. And so you would find that out simply by letting them know how you think about the For the People Act. But let me give you kind of a program note that tomorrow we're going to get into some more of these controversial issues. Jim Dennison is going to be with us as we talk about some of the issues that we have addressed in the past, everything from media censorship, might even get into the whole issue of so-called Christian nationalism. Mike Gonzalez is going to be with us talking about the attempt through the Biden administration to achieve racial equity and what equity means versus equality. So that's going to be a topic that we have certainly put on the website there as well, and we'll be talking about tomorrow. So we hope that you'll be able to join us then. And just before we run out of time, let me also mention that my commentary today is entitled Bipartisan Issues. It comes from an interview we did just recently with George Barna, in which he did a post-election survey of both Republicans and Democrats and found out something very interesting. We have enormous bipartisan support for a number of issues, a essentially supermajority of both Republicans and Democrats on certain issues, and then went back and found that there is a complete lack of bipartisan support on some of the key issues being promoted right now by the Biden administration. So if we're looking for unity and we're looking for bipartisan solutions, there are many that we could actually pick, and I talk about that on the website and on my commentary. So I hope you'll take the time to read that, maybe pass it on to others. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for the help behind the scenes. We will look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.